There's a particular kind of person you might know. Maybe you are this person. They decline invitations not because they dislike you, but because the couch feels like where they belong. They cancel plans and feel relief instead of guilt. They spend their weekends inside, while everyone else seems to be everywhere, documenting everything, proving they're alive. And these people, the ones who love staying home, they're not missing out on life. They're living it differently, more quietly, more intentionally. And if you ask them, they'll tell you they've never felt more themselves than when they're alone in their own space. This is the psychology of people who love staying at home. And before you assume it's about fear or laziness or social anxiety, let me tell you what it's really about. It's about nervous systems that crave predictability. It's about minds that need silence to process the noise they've absorbed all week. It's about hearts that have learned the difference between loneliness and solitude. And it's about people who have discovered that the most profound version of themselves doesn't emerge in crowds. It emerges in the quiet. Let's start with what actually happens psychologically when someone prefers being home. There's a concept in psychology called optimal stimulation level. Everyone has a threshold for how much external input they can handle before it becomes overwhelming. For some people, that threshold is high. They need constant activity, new faces, busy environments to feel alive. But for others, that threshold is lower. Not because they're weak or broken, but because their nervous system processes stimulation more intensely. Every conversation, every sound, every social interaction registers more deeply. And when you feel everything so intensely, you need a place to recover. That place is home. This isn't introversion, though people often confuse the two. You can be extroverted and still love staying home, because it's not about whether you enjoy people, it's about where you feel safe enough to stop performing, where you can take off the social mask and just exist without commentary. Home becomes the only place where you're not being observed, evaluated, or expected to be anything other than exactly what you are in that moment. Here's what people don't understand. When someone loves staying home, they're not avoiding life, they're curating it. Because every time you say yes to something external, you're saying no to something internal. And for people who love staying home, the internal world is rich, complex, and endlessly fascinating. They have entire landscapes inside their minds, thoughts that branch into other thoughts, ideas that need time to develop, emotions that require space to be felt fully. And none of that can happen when you're constantly out there, consuming experiences you don't have time to process. Think about the last time you had a revelation, the last time you truly understood something about yourself or your life. It probably didn't happen at a party. It probably happened in the shower, or late at night lying in bed, or during a quiet morning with coffee. Because clarity requires stillness. And people who love staying home have learned to protect that stillness like it's sacred. Because to them, it is. But let's be honest about where this preference often begins. For many people, loving home wasn't always a choice. It started as survival. Maybe they grew up in chaotic environments where home was the only place they could control. Maybe they experienced rejection or betrayal that taught them people are unpredictable, but spaces are reliable. Maybe they were the kind of kid who felt too much, noticed too much, and learned that being alone was easier than explaining why everything felt so intense. So they built an inner world, a sanctuary, and they've been living there ever since. There's also a neurological component that most people overlook. Studies on brain activity show that people who prefer solitude have different patterns of dopamine regulation. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter associated with reward and pleasure. For most people, social interaction triggers dopamine release, which feels good, which makes them crave more social interaction. But for others, dopamine is released more readily during solo activities. reading, creating, thinking, resting. Their brains are literally wired to find pleasure in different places. So when they stay home, they're not depriving themselves. They're giving themselves exactly what their brain needs to feel satisfied. And here's where it gets interesting. People who love staying home often have what psychologists call high internal locus of control. That means they believe their happiness and fulfillment come from within, not from external circumstances. They don't need constant validation or excitement from the outside world because they've learned to generate meaning internally. They can sit in a room alone and feel content because their sense of self doesn't depend on who's looking at them or what they're doing. It depends on how aligned they feel with their own values, thoughts, and choices. But society doesn't celebrate this. Society celebrates visibility, being out, being busy, being social. And when you're someone who loves staying home, you're constantly met with concern disguised as care. Are you okay? Don't you get bored? You should get out more. And underneath those questions is an assumption that staying home means something is wrong with you, that you're depressed or lonely or wasting your life. But what if you're not? What if you're just someone who has discovered that happiness doesn't require an audience? Let's talk about what staying home actually looks like for these people, because it's not what you think. It's not sitting in darkness, scrolling through social media feeling left out. It's waking up slowly without an alarm. It's making breakfast and actually tasting it instead of rushing. It's spending hours on a hobby that has no purpose other than the joy it brings. It's rearranging furniture just to see how the space feels different. It's reading a book so good you forget to check your phone. It's existing in your own rhythm, your own timeline, without having to synchronize with anyone else. And that feels like freedom. There's also something deeply restorative about being in a space you control. When you're out in the world, you're constantly adapting. Adapting to the temperature, the noise, the pace, the social dynamics. Your nervous system is in a low-level state of alert because you're navigating variables you can't control. But at home, everything is familiar. You know where everything is. You know what to expect. And that predictability allows your body to fully relax. Your cortisol levels drop. Your breathing deepens. Your mind stops scanning for threats. And in that relaxation, healing happens. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind. The kind that happens when you finally stop bracing for impact. People who love staying home also tend to have a different relationship with time. When you're constantly out, time becomes a series of events, plans, appointments, obligations. But when you're home, time becomes spacious. You can spend an hour doing nothing and not feel like you wasted it. You can lose track of time in a good way, where you're so absorbed in a moment that hours disappear. And that's a rare kind of luxury, because most people live their entire lives without ever experiencing time that isn't measured, scheduled, or accounted for. But here's the shadow side. Sometimes people love staying home not because they've found peace, but because they've given up. They've been hurt too many times by people who didn't see them, didn't value them, didn't stay. So they stopped trying. They stopped hoping that connection could feel easy. And they retreated into a place where disappointment can't reach them. And that's different. That's not solitude. That's withdrawal. And it's worth being honest about which one you're experiencing. Because solitude energizes you. Withdrawal depletes you. Solitude is chosen. Withdrawal is protective. And knowing the difference is crucial. There's also the reality of what people miss when they stay home. Yes, they miss the noise, the drama, the shallow conversations, the exhaustion of pretending to be interested in things they don't care about. But they also miss spontaneity, the unexpected connection, the moment when a stranger says something that shifts your perspective, the feeling of being part of something larger than yourself. And for some people, that trade-off is worth it. But for others, it starts to feel like a cage they've built themselves. So the key is balance, knowing when staying home is nourishing and when it's numbing. Let's talk about relationships, because people who love staying home often struggle with intimacy. Not because they don't want it, but because intimacy requires letting someone into your space. Your physical space, yes, but also your mental and emotional space. And when you've built your entire world around being alone, inviting someone in feels vulnerable. It feels like you're giving up the one thing that's entirely yours. So they love at a distance. They care deeply, but don't always know how to show it. They value the few people they let close, but rarely expand that circle. And to outsiders, this can look cold. But it's not. It's just selective. They're protecting the peace they've worked so hard to create. Here's something most people don't realize. People who love staying home are often the most observant. Because when you're not busy performing, you're busy noticing. You see patterns others miss. You understand people in ways they don't understand themselves. You listen more than you speak because you're genuinely curious about the depth beneath the surface. And that makes you a rare kind of friend. The kind who remembers details, who checks in quietly, who doesn't need constant contact to care deeply. But it also means you get exhausted by people who can't meet you at that depth, who only want surface-level interaction. And that's why you'd rather be home, because shallow connection is lonelier than being alone. There's also a creative advantage to loving home. So many artists, writers, musicians, thinkers, they were people who spent vast amounts of time alone. Not because they were antisocial, but because creation requires solitude. You can't hear your own voice when everyone else is talking. You can't develop ideas when you're constantly consuming other people's ideas. You need silence. You need boredom. You need unstructured time where your mind can wander. And people who love staying home give themselves that gift. They're not just existing, they're incubating. Ideas, dreams, versions of themselves that haven't been born yet. And that requires space. But the world will always judge you for choosing differently. Because we live in a culture that equates worth with productivity and visibility. If you're not out there hustling, socializing, proving you're alive, people assume you're wasting your potential. But what if the most important work you're doing is invisible? What if the time you spend alone is what allows you to show up as your best self in the moments that matter? What if staying home isn't about avoiding life, but about honoring the life you have inside you? Here's the truth. People who love staying home aren't broken. They're not missing out. They're not afraid. They're just people who have learned that the world doesn't define them, that their value doesn't decrease when no one's watching, that happiness isn't something you chase in crowded places. It's something you cultivate in quiet moments. And maybe that's the greatest lesson they have to offer. That you don't need to be everywhere to be someone. You just need to be fully present wherever you are, even if that's home. Especially if that's home. So if you're someone who loves staying home, stop apologizing for it. Stop feeling guilty. Stop letting people make you feel like you're doing life wrong. You're not missing out. You're tuning in. You're living at your own pace, in your own way, on your own terms. And that's not just okay. That's beautiful. Because the world needs people who know how to be still, who can find meaning in simplicity, who can sit in silence and not feel the need to fill it. You're not less than, you're just different. And different is exactly what you're supposed to be.